All right. So first of all, I would like to have our speakers to have a brief introduction. So may I go from the order on my list? Professor John Thorgerson from Denmark, please.
Good morning, everyone, or good day, good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm John Thorgerson. Or Thorgerson, it's difficult to pronounce the Danish Ø for foreigners. I'm a professor of economic psychology at Aarhus University, Denmark. I do research on all kinds of sustainable consumer behavior, including transport behaviors. And I'm going to present a paper that I published together with a student on the demand for electric cars in Denmark.
Okay, thank you, John. Professor Susan Grant-Muller from Leeds.
Hello, everyone. I'm Susan Grant-Muller from the Institute for Transport Studies at the University of Leeds. I'm Professor of Technologies and Informatics. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of new and emerging data in improving our understanding of some of the sustainability outcomes of e-scooters.
Okay, thank you, Susan. And we have Professor Sandeep Chakrabarty from India. Sandeep.
Hi, yeah. Hi, thanks, Sylvia. Hi, everyone. I'm Sandeep Chakrabarty. I'm an associate professor of urban development and transportation here at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. And my interests are in travel behavior analysis, impact assessments of investments, and everything to do with thinking about how we can promote more sustainable forms of transportation. And today I'm going to talk about, it's titled The Future of Urban Mobility in India. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of where we are in terms of transportation planning in India, where we are headed, and some of the challenges on our way to promoting sustainable urban transportation in Indian cities. So yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks, Sandeep. So the last presenter is myself. I will present the case of Hong Kong, focusing on the spatial planning of public EV charging station. And in Hong Kong early this year in March, the government published the first roadmap to promote electric vehicle and set a timeline to phase out the ICE vehicles by 2035. So I think in this presentation, I would like to see how we can plan the public EV chargers in a very high density city. So thank you very much. And then in the round table discussion session, we also have 4 discussants. So first we have Mr. Alok Jain, CEO and Managing Director from Transconsult. Alok?
Yeah, hi Sylvia. Thank you. My name is Alok, and I'm based in Hong Kong. I've been working I'm more of a practitioner, so I'm in very august company of a lot of professors here. I come from, I have done train operation, bus operation all my life. These days I go around as consultant. So, but my area of work is very similar to what other professors have done, is public transport operations and management. We are doing a lot of work on electric buses and general decarbonization of transport within Asian cities. So thanks. Thank you, Sylvia.
Thank you, Alok. Next, we have Dr. Yiming Wang, Senior Lecturer from University of Bristol. Yiming.
Oh, hi. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you. I'm Yiming Wang. I'm a Senior Lecturer in the Center for Urban and Public Policy Research, and also based in the School for Policy Studies at the University of Bristol. My research interests mainly on the supply side of transport infrastructure. Including, for instance, land value capture to finance public transport infrastructure. So with regard to this particular project, and also for the roundtable discussion, which is going to take place later in the session, I'm going to talk about the policy implications for post-COVID cities with relation to electric vehicles, especially electric public transport infrastructure.
Okay, thanks, Yiming. Next, we have Mr. Kathy Low, Senior Transport Planner from EROP. Kathy.
Hello, hi everyone. My name is Kathy. So working with EROP. I'm also a practitioner, which we do a wide range of transportation planning projects here. But particularly later on in the roundtable sessions, I will talk about more on walkability, so-called active mobility in Hong Kong. As we Arab are also working on a wide range of pedestrian cities, and I think in the sustainable development arena, I think it has a lot to play. Of course, right now we are working with Professor Sylvia on a future transport research project together, which we are looking into opportunities to implement those in Hong Kong. So hopefully we can share some of the findings later on. Yep. Thanks all.
Thanks, Kathy. Next we have Dr. Rensford, a champion, Presidential Academic Fellow from University of Manchester. Rensford?
Hi, Sylvia. Hi everyone. My name is Ransford Champon, and I have a bit of fancy job title, which is Presidential Academic Fellow in Future Cities. For those of you who don't really know what that is, it's something similar to Assistant Research Professor here at the University of Manchester. And I research mainly about the future of transport and mobility with a focus on new transport technologies, new mobility services, such as autonomous vehicles, autonomous transport, car sharing, and other ICT-mediated mobility systems. So as part of the roundtable discussions, I'm basically going to provoke a discussion, if I can put it that way, around the future of mobility in the context of autonomous vehicles and how we can begin to look at some of the possible travel behavior and wider sustainability impacts. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Ransford. So thank you all for the introduction. And now I think we can start the first part, our presentation. And each presenter will have 15 minutes for a presentation and then followed by 5 minutes Q&A. So with that, may I invite Professor John Ferguson to start the presentation? Thank you. John, you are muted.
And I am going to share my screen. Just a moment.
So John's presentation is about the demand for electric cars in Denmark.
Did I share my screen now? I think
Yes.
so. Let me see if I can get it up here. Yeah. So yeah, thank you for giving me the chance to present this work on the demand for electric cars in Denmark. Denmark is a country that is known for trying to advance the environmental agendas in many places. As you probably know, Denmark, you may know or may not know, Denmark has a very ambitious general goal for climate change, a goal of reducing its climate impact by 70% by 2030. And including, this also includes a policy for electric cars that has gone, well, far back in history, but it has also changed over the years. It's been since 2080s, it's been the official policy by the government to reduce the registration of new combustion engine cars by 2030, and also to reach at least 775,000 electric cars by 2030. It's of course important to know that we are a population of about 5.5 million people. So this is actually a relatively ambitious goal. Many of us would like that goal to be more ambitious, but of course it's not as easy as one could imagine. At the end of 2017, when we did the data collection for this paper, there was less than 10,000 electric cars in Denmark. 0.3% of the total number of registered cars. That number has gone up quite dramatically since 2017. But in the sense that there's now about the double number. So it is actually going. The government in Denmark has promoted electric cars for a long time, most importantly by exempting them from registration tax until 2015. And the Danish registration tax is one of the highest in the world, so that's actually a substantial subsidy. It's by now, it's for most cars, 150% registration tax plus 25% VAT also on the registration tax. Since 2015, there's been like a policy of gradually introducing a registration tax, but the current situation is that electric cars in Denmark that are cost less than 500,000 Danish kroner, which would be 75,000 euro, are exempt, in reality exempt from registration tax. But it's still going quite relatively slow compared to Norway. In 2017, a smaller population owned more than 100,000 electric cars in Norway, and I think many of you will know that by now, like Norway is by far our neighboring country, like by far the most advanced electric car country in the world. So we like to compare ourselves to the Norwegian situation. So there's still much to do also in Denmark, and much to do in order to understand the factors that hold the electric car market back in Denmark. And we know, of course, there are supply and context factors, but that play a role, such as the charging infrastructure and the types of cars that are available. But demand factors and motivation factors are also partly responsible, and over time they have attracted much less research attention. So the focus in this paper is on the most important psychological drivers and impediments of willingness to adopt electric cars in Denmark. So what is holding the market back psychologically? Buying a car is not something people do every day, and it's actually next to the house. It's the biggest investment a person usually does in their life. So it's a very risky thing, and it's not something people just do spontaneously. They will consider it quite thoroughly. So we adopted what is sometimes referred to as a recent action framework for this research, like assuming that people will reason quite thoroughly before they buy an electric car. The reason is, that it's a relatively risky thing to do. Most studies of electric car adoption also use such a recent action framework. Many use conjoint analysis. Some use the technology acceptance model or the theory of planned behavior when they are studying the antecedents to buy an electric car. And sometimes the models are extended with non-rational factors that play a role, such as emotions and moral principles. For instance, in Christian Klückner's group in Norway, they found that a felt moral obligation or personal norm to own an eco-friendly car had a strong impact on the intention to buy an electric car in Norway. And for this reason, we also wanted to include this factor. Like, is it to see if this Denmark as another Nordic country that share many of the values of Norway would also see that adoption as a moral decision. Their prior research on the adoption of electric cars have identified a number of barriers to adoption. most of it has focused on structural and technological barriers, the range, charging time, and charging infrastructure, especially being prominent according to most research, but also some functional barriers that people, potential adopters, tend to find, perceived risk, the value of the car, like how user-friendly it is, the complexity of the recharging process have been pointed out, and also uncertainty about this new technology. In addition to perceived economic risk, the most important economic risk that has been pointed at is the durability of the battery. The battery is extremely expensive, and of course, people, especially earlier, feared that the battery wouldn't last so long. So the electric car producers had various guarantees for battery life, but also the resale price. Like it can be difficult to know if it holds its value as much as a conventional car, which is of course also really important. In addition, there could be very psychological risks, which the kind of image you project on others from having an electric cars, and will it fit with your traditions and so on and habits. And most importantly, many risks and deficiencies are difficult to judge before the purchase. So some researchers have pointed at that attitudes and perceptions may improve with experience. And so we also took that as a key proposition in our research. In terms of drivers of adoption of electric cars, prior research has found that electric car owners are more concerned about environmental problems, and that the electric cars are often valued for the eco-friendliness, although not all research agrees upon that, but most research actually does. In a Scandinavian context, it's been found that like personal and moral norms that are rooted in the awareness of the negative environmental consequences of driving a combustion engine car are found to be a strong predictor of intentions, especially by Glöckner's group in Trondheim. So based on this prior research, we formulated quite a long range of hypotheses, expectations about for this study here, that the intention to buy an electric car will increase with the adopter's evaluation of an electric car compared to a conventional car, reflected in the overall attitude toward buying an electric car, and it also increasing with how common and accepted the social norms is in the person's social context, and with a person's perceived moral obligation to choose an environmentally friendly car. We also hypothesized that the intention to buy an electric car increases with concerns about negative environmental impacts of road traffic, and that this concern is mediated through personal norms. The intention to buy an electric car, we also assume, increases with the perceived ease of use from proposed by the technology acceptance model, and that experience uncertainty has a negative influence on the intention to buy. And then we assumed that experience with an electric car would positively affect everything, like beliefs, attitudes, norms, etc., because it would reduce people's uncertainty and prejudices. We did a survey in Denmark where we oversampled. It was a convenient sample at this time. We oversampled owners of an electric car relatively to non-owners, and our dependent variable, like we predicted, we used buying intention as measured with 2 items, and then we had a range of different antecedents that I expressed in the hypotheses before. These the construct that we measured possess, most of them, eminent construct reliability and average variance extracted. So the construct and discriminant validities were fine. The exception being descriptive norms where because so few people at this time had bought an electric car, there was not a lot of knowledge about or perception about what other people would do, which is what the descriptive norms predict. All the correlations between buying intention and other constructs have the expected sign, and they are highly significant. And we developed this model for that as the framework for our study. You could see a quite complex structural model predicting intention to buy an electric car based on some immediate psychological antecedents, the personal norms to buying an environmentally friendly car, the attitudes to buying an electric car, perceived ease of using an electric car, and perceived uncertainty. And then we assumed that the social norms, divided into injunctive and descriptive social norms, would also influence intention to buy, but mediated through the personal norm. And so would, like the personal norm of buying an environmentally friendly car, would also be influenced by environmental concerns. And then a range of specific beliefs would, like what people's salient beliefs about electric cars would influence these proximate indicators as well. We measured salient beliefs in this population using qualitative interviews to identify the most salient beliefs in the population about electric cars and buying an electric cars. And then we assumed that experience with electric cars, as reflected in whether or not you own one already, would influence all other things in this model here. So that people who had experience would have with an electric car would have more favorable beliefs, more favorable norms, more favorable attitudes, more favorable ease of use, and less uncertainty. And therefore, they also would have higher intentions to buy an electric car. Let me quickly show some key results. If we've, like, the overall model was very effective at predicting intention to buy an electric car. And what you can see here is that the strongest factor influencing the intention to buy is perceived ease of using an electric car. So also here in Denmark at this time here, it's still the impediments and troubles that people perceive with regard to charging and the range of the car that was the most important factor influencing the intention to buy. The second most important factor was the personal norm, of buying an environmentally friendly car. So it appears that, like in Norway, that among Danes, there's quite many people have a strong sense of duty to own a car that is not too taxing on the environment, and that is what makes them interested in buying an electric car. Attitudes and uncertainty also play a role, and norms play the indirect roles that we thought. Let me just, I think I'm out of time, but let me just also show you just the types of beliefs that we found had an impact, as we identified a range of beliefs that were important for people's assessment of electric cars, including its environmentally friendliness, limited range, ability to home charge, operating costs, technology expectations, driving pleasure, and price. And these were those among the many more beliefs that we identified that really had an impact on the whole decision process. And we also found that owners are much more likely to intend, like people who already have experience with an electric car, much more likely to intend to buy an electric car than non-owners. And as we expected, experience had a positive impact on everything here, like more favorable belief, more favorable attitudes, etc. So in conclusion, and very quickly, that intention to buy an electric car depends on experience to a very high extent, and they also buying intentions are also positively related to evaluating of attitudes towards electric cars, optimism of electric car technology, and not least personal norms regarding owning an environmentally friendly car. And they are negatively influenced by expectations about difficulties regarding the everyday management of an electric car, like and uncertainty about the new technology. Some of this is like, I'm happy to say that there's been a lot of focus since 2017 in Denmark in trying to reduce these negative factors, which I think is the main reason why we have seen an increase in the number of electric cars in Denmark. And of course, the mere fact that more cars are there for people to see, and as both of social proof and reflecting social expectations has probably a positive role as well. I think I have to stop here. I already went a minute or two over my time, I think, but thank you for your attention.
Thanks, John, for the very interesting result, and the model also, I think, revealed a lot of the psychological barriers for the potential EV adopters. I think now we have time for one question, and may I know if the audience would like to ask Professor Torbensen any questions? Any question from the audience? So if not, I will take this opportunity. So actually, John, I would like to know, at the beginning, you said that Norway has a very successful case. So according to your model, do you think which factors in Norway compared to Denmark is influential for explaining their success recently?
Well, yes, I believe that the most important things that explains the Norwegian situation is actually that the beliefs were more favorable. If you like the differentiation between Denmark and Norway, and as I mentioned, some of the beliefs about operating costs and the price, but especially the operating cost was the major difference between Norway and Denmark, which means that and both Norway and Denmark had strong tax relief for electric cars for a long time, but Norway added on top of that a number of additional benefits, including some of you may know or may not know that Norway has followed a number of other countries in having a congestion charge among bigger cities, and they have that among all the biggest cities, and electric cars have been exempted from that, which is a substantial saving and we don't have that in Denmark. And one more thing that's a difference is that the electricity price in Norway is maybe around 10% of the electricity price in Denmark. So electricity is much cheaper. So which again makes it more economical. So I think that was kind of the basic difference that like these beliefs, and so that made Norwegians start earlier. Like the morality part and so on, I think is very much shared. So it's not a difference between the two countries.
Okay, thanks, John, for explaining the key differences in the belief side. So thanks a lot. And next we will have Professor Susan Graham-Miller from University of Leeds to share with us the role of e-scooters in healthy and sustainable travel. Susan, the stage is yours.
Hello, thank you. I'm just loading my presentation. Can you see that okay, Sylvia?
Yes, it's fine.
Great. Okay, lovely. So I'm going to talk this morning in the context of the role of e-scooters in healthy and sustainable travel. But my focus really, as I mentioned at the beginning, is what can we gain by engaging with some of the new and emerging data forms in the way that we study this topic as well. So my collaborators, I will just mention, are from the University of Cambridge in the UK. That's Dr. Jenna Panta and Professor James Woodcock. And we're also collaborating with Voice Scooters. So a little bit of background, first of all. In the UK, the e-scooter schemes were introduced in July 2020. So this is a very recent phenomena for us, if you like. And they were introduced as a trial, although worldwide, of course, everyone will be perhaps aware that the trials and implementations have been underway for quite some time. A review is happening now in this late part of 2021, which is concerned with whether to proceed with the use of e-scooters as a mode within the UK, or whether maybe some adjustments are needed to the way these are implemented. But basically, some of the features about the way it's being introduced in the UK, at the moment there are 57 cities across the UK with schemes in place. Some of these are campus-based schemes, so at universities, etc., and some are citywide schemes. There are maximum speed restrictions in place, which is 15.5 kilometres, which is much lower than the capability of the scooters, and there is considerable variation internationally in terms of the rules and regulations that apply when shared e-scooter schemes, I should say, are brought in. It's also the case that in the UK, a driving licence is required, and this acts in two ways, I think. First of all, it acts as a limitation on who can engage with shared e-scooter schemes, and it also ensures that the people who are taking up the scooters have some basic road awareness, safety awareness, etc. And a helmet is recommended, so that is the UK case. Again, there are different practices internationally. The main research question we're concerned with here is whether there is a role for new and emerging data in understanding whether shared e-scooter schemes engender sustainability outcomes. What I'm presenting here are initial substantive outcomes. So these are sort of findings, reflections. Our survey only finished literally a couple of months ago, so this is very early days for us. So in order to investigate this research question, we implemented a user survey across the Voice Scooter database with their collaboration, and in line with the user preferences, so everybody had agreed to receive the mail and be invited to join the survey. We had 2,432 responses. We collected, using a traditional questionnaire data format, information on the demographics, so age, gender, ethnicity, etc., some basic health characteristics. This is a little bit about self-reported fitness and BMI, other measurements as well. Also, transport-related variables such as access to a car or other forms of travel, characteristics of the household, but also household income and employment. So we've got quite a rich database about the people who've responded to us. We asked about people's last trip, so the last trip they took. So for some users, that was the only trip if they've only used it once, but also for some more frequent users, trips in the last month. We also surveyed about the purpose of using e-scooter, the trip length in minutes, information about mode switch, the motivation, self-reported measures of well-being and more. The map that you can see there on the right-hand side of the screen shows the locations of the users who responded to us. So I will say something now about some of the findings that have come out. Just to try and position this a little bit, the e-scooters have been around as large-scale implementations internationally since around 2017. And in terms of reporting some research around scooters, the literature is in different states of maturity. There are a lot of reviews around focusing on particular topics, quite a lot of material in Transportation Research D for anybody who's wanting to have a look at that, with very recent publications, some special issues and so on, some of which are delving into particular parts of the questions, such as the integration of e-scooters with other PT services, bus, train, etc. So there is a lot there. However, the market is still in its first stages. This is still a competitive landscape, and quite a bit of the findings, I think, from research is housed in what we might call grey literature. So maybe within companies and organisations, maybe some government departments and stakeholder findings, etc. So it's actually more difficult with e-scooters to find comparable literature and findings than maybe it is for some other modes that have been around for quite some time. But here we can see something about the characteristics of our sample that have responded to us. So first of all, in terms of the age band, we can all maybe think about e-scooters and have particular stereotypes about who uses them. We can see here that males are predominant across the age bands compared with females. This is probably comparable, I think, to the situation for traditional scooters, a manual bike, for example. This is reflective of that. What may surprise some individuals is the age band of the users that we've got here. So there is an idea that all e-scooters, or many, are in this kind of age group, the 22 to the 30 group, but in fact we've got a slightly more mature profile by age coming across in the sample. Now, just to position this again, it could be that just our respondents are the mature end of the sample, and there could be very many young people who chose not to respond to us. So I think that's one feature. It's very pleasing to see individuals up to 61 to 65, 66 to 75 even, and that's terrific. So in terms of ethnicity, predominantly white, but notable numbers of mixed or multiple ethnicities, and Asian or Asian British, and Black and other ethnicities here. And one of the features that we've seen within the UK is that there is an emerging subgroup of e-scooter users who are from particular subcultures, sub-ethnicities, even sub-age groups, I think, where having an e-scooter is a super cool thing to do. Not only is it a mode of transport, but it's become a focus of a small community that's emerging. So then if we have a look at employment status, again, I've split this by gender. There wasn't anything significant about that. I'm just doing a cut. We just did a cut across gender to help to split this up. But we can see that the vast majority are employed, but there are also a number from other groups, including unemployed, self-employed individuals, and other categories. So homemakers, students, I think maybe this is a feature of the fact that e-scooters are a good transport option in and around campus, and for people who've got very short journeys to take, which often students are living close to or not huge travel distances away from locations of education. And then if we have a look at household income versus gender again, we can have a look and see that there is quite a large group here who prefer not to say. This is partly characteristic of the kinds of outcomes we get with many different kinds of questionnaire surveys in the UK, in that for us it is a slightly awkward topic to discuss. We aren't, I think this is a sweeping statement, so forgive me, but we aren't very culturally disposed to talking about how much income we've got, and we find similar opt-out, high opt-outs in other surveys that we're doing with mobile phone apps and other kinds of technologies. However, we can see as well that there is a propensity really almost to have two groups here, some high earning individuals and some at the lower end of the groups as well. And this probably reflects some of the market split with some, again, some students and people who are maybe unemployed as part of this group, as well as people who are business users and from other communities. So I wanted to give you a little taste of what's happening with some of the questionnaire results here. We did ask people about their purpose to use the e-scooters, and you can see some factors that are maybe the ones that we expected to find, so to save time, a little bit to save money, etc. But what's maybe encouraging in the environmental context is to see that almost 22.5% of people did it for environmental reasons, and that also reflects a growing culture and awareness of what's happening in terms of sustainability and the need to reconsider our travel choices, particularly in the UK where we've got small land masses and not great opportunity for expansion, but also a lot of emissions issues. So some other findings here, we can see in terms of mode substitution, almost 9% of the last scooter trip that people took was substituting a car alone trip. So this wasn't car in conjunction with anything else or taxi alone. So these are key findings for us, because these are different types of journey to the ones that included mixed modes. So here we've got 76% were substituting for a mode which included other modes. So walk-in, cycling, for example, car plus walk, train plus cycle. And in fact, at least a quarter of the last scooter trip was substituting for multimodal trips. Yes, for multimodal trips. So that's something we need to think about when we consider the environmental outcomes. And almost 9% of them were generator trips. These are typically trips that are there for fun, enjoyment, pleasure, etc., that wouldn't have been taken otherwise. So when we think about the carbon cost for travel by each of the modes, this is a multifaceted problem, with running costs only being a small part of the whole life cycle costs. And those who are familiar with life cycle analysis will know we need to start right from sourcing and obtaining raw materials all the way to the actual decommissioning of the product at the end, the mode at the end. So the running costs and the operation costs are only a very small part of that. If we were to, we can have a look at how we can analyse data that comes through in this self-reported way. This is looking at the taxi and car substitution trips only, and we can see the one-way scooter time in minutes. Here it's got this skewed journey time that we expect for both of these modes, and that's because we would anticipate that scooter trips are for shorter journeys rather than for very long journeys. But we can either analyse these data for each individual and for each individual trip, which is a possibility we've got with this data, or we can look at this in broad aggregate form and say, well, the maximum speed is 15.5 miles per hour in the UK. We can get a rough estimate of the distance that's been travelled using basic distance speed time relationships, and to estimate from this that taxi substitutes on average trips to around 4 miles or 6.5 kilometres, and just over that figure for the car trips. Now 15.5 miles per hour is very speedy. There will be some speeds that were much lower than that due to congestion and other factors, people just not wanting to ride at that speed and so on. We would need to know something about the carbon emissions of the alternative modes to be able to take these calculations further. So this data was sourced easily from Statista, but there are many other sources. So depending on the vehicle type, this could have a substantial impact on the emissions that these e-scooter trips have substituted for. If they were substituting from an average battery electric vehicle car, they would be half those for less than half those, a third of those than for an average petrol car, for example. But you can see from that how we could take this further. So that's something about what happens when we do questionnaires with people, and we get issues with self-reported trip time, mode substitution, and the complexity of multi-mode journeys, being able to report that easily through a questionnaire format. There is high variation in the CO2 per vehicle type, so we would need the vehicle mix to properly estimate those. There are errors in data and interpretation of the question, how people interpreted what we were asking them. And we did have some maverick responses, which again is part and parcel of doing traditional surveys. Our next steps then, I've just got a few very short time left, is we're going to look at the trip data from over 900 respondents who've given us permission to co-analyse with their historic scooter trips. So we will have their demographic and their GPS traces on their scooter trips, which is going to be super interesting. This will allow us to do far more detailed insights and to do some benchmarking against the responses we've got. We're also going to offer respondents either a wearable wristband or to download a tracking app, which will give tracking data including the full journey location, the trajectory, the mode and other variables. And we can again benchmark that data that comes out with the questionnaire data. And get some more detailed analysis of whole journeys, not just the scooter trip and the context. But what we need to bear in mind when we do this is that both data sets will have errors, biases and challenges. So we don't assume that either is the ground truth, and we're going to co-analyse both of them together to get the best out. I'm not going to go through the last slide, Sylvia, because I've overstayed my welcome in my slot. But that you can see here some of the opportunities that I think that we've got with the new data, including the detection of some of the micro stages to the journey, which is key to understanding the full sustainability potential. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Susan, for sharing this very interesting study and the preliminary result. And so we see a participant raise their hands. Can you unmute yourself? We see Buvana from Germany and also Rensford. You can unmute yourself and ask question.
Thank you, Susan, for this presentation. I really love this because we conducted a study on e-mobility in Dortmund, Germany last year. And because I just can relate to the findings, whatever you have presented, but my question is because we conducted our SWOT analysis, so where we saw this opportunities, threats and weakness and strength, and so because some of the points which I received like as an analysis we got as a threat and were not somehow discussed, probably you would make it as a next step, or I would like to know if you would inquire more. The first is about the infrastructure, because here the problem was the infrastructure. The respondents, they say that it's not really convenient for someone who uses e-scooter, because it has been both on the pedestrian and on the cycling way. So they have constraint using that, and also the parking problem with respect to the infrastructure, because they park somewhere and it's really creating a problem for pedestrians and and bicyclists. And this is one. And the next is the cost. And because here, I don't know about in Leeds and also in UK, here it is costly. It is perceived as a costlier thing because the higher income can afford to use the rental services on the e-scooters, but not like the lower income. Then we get to know the correlation. And so I would like to know how you perceive this. The next question is something related to first mile and last mile problem, because here it's not the only solution to this problem, but they propose this new mobility service as a connectivity for first mile and last mile, because most of the replacement, as I also see in your results, like 75% has been replaced by walking and cycling, and only 8% by car. So at the end, it's going to again put a pressure on the physical fitness, right? Whoever just go by walk or cycle, they will be slowly switched to this e-mobility or whatever you call that e-scooter. But at the end, only minimal percent has been replaced by car. So how this is going to be perceived as an environmental or a sustainable point of view? Yeah, I have more questions, but it's fine. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, that's lots of really interesting questions that I can see. We've got you know, a lot of common agendas with this. I just want to start with the last one, if I can do, because this is very close to my heart. It is definitely the case that to walk for the whole journey or to cycle for the whole journey is probably both more sustainable and is going to encourage health benefits. So I don't think anybody would argue with that. However, what we did find is self-reported levels of how active the journey was are high for some of our e-scooter users. So people felt that they would be more active compared with the other modes that they would normally use. And that's maybe a psychological phenomenon of being out in the fresh air and just the manual process of handling the scooter. I don't know. There's lots to delve into there. What I was interested to see was the number of older people who are using e-scooters who perhaps would not use a bike or walk. And we asked the fitness questions about the ability to walk for 3 miles or more. Sorry, it was 1 mile or more, not 3 miles, 1 mile or more, and their basic BMI, so their weight and their height, to understand how fit some of the respondents were. But we also asked about impairment to mobility, and something like 5% of our sample were actually mobility impaired. So these were people who struggled to use particular kinds of the modes. And of course, it is the case that not everybody can cycle because there are also we actually have quite an interesting topography, which is hills and valleys in a lot of our spaces in the UK. But also, people the provision of shared bike doesn't always cater to people who are a little bit shorter, not as tall, don't have as long legs as I put myself in that category. So there are benefits, but we also bear in mind those disbenefits, and some of our future analysis is going to look at some of those health implications and the extent to which we can pick up how active people are actually being on the scooter. But of course, yes, the substitution for some of those 100% active modes is something that we have to weigh in and trade off against those. In terms of the cost, quite a few of our our shared scooter providers do have sort of carnet and discount tickets that are available for people who are unemployed or low income, or also for certain groups like NHS workers or those who are doing working in occupations that serve the community. So although cost did come up as an issue with some of the feedback that we've got, I think that we have some schemes that help to mitigate that. But the pricing structures as well, also complex topic, I think, tend to discourage the use of longer journeys. So once you get past a certain amount of time, it becomes very expensive to use this. So that dictates in some ways the kind of use these will be put to. I'm going to stop there because it's Sylvia's got lots of more presenters, but I'm very happy to pick this up in a separate discussion and answer some more of those questions.
Oh, thanks, Susan. And okay, so we have 2 more guests. I hope maybe Susan can also help answer. Please, Ransford and Boris, try to keep your question short. So maybe Ransford, go first.
Yeah, I'll ask 2 quick questions. We can discuss in detail later on if there isn't time. The first one, I think, picks up on one of the earlier questions, and I think my observation based on the mode substitution analysis is that e-scooters are essentially motorizing, non-motorized trips, active modes of transport. But then at the same time, they're not being recognized and treated as motorized forms of transport. And I'm really interested in the urban design and also the infrastructure implications for, e-scooters as a motorized form of transport that is competing with walking in the first place, and also the infrastructure that currently exists. Limited infrastructure that exists for walking as a mode of transport. So how do we navigate this? The second question is about, I just wanted to know if in your analysis you've done some work around the geography of the trials themselves. So where they choose to implement these trials and the decisions that are going into the trial sites, and how that, you know, the wider implications it has on the sort of respondents that you are getting, and also the intended target groups for these new forms of mobility. Thanks.
Okay, I'll try and answer these as quickly as I can. So first of all, it was the government who decided whether the trials would take place at high level. So plans had to be put forward, and they were screened and assessed, and so those decisions was sort of not, it wasn't an autonomous decision on the part of any of the suppliers. And there are a number of suppliers in the UK, although this research is in collaboration with VOI, there are others, and we do work with other suppliers, I should say that. But the infrastructure one is one which remains to be solved in the long term. So these schemes were brought in as a trial, initially a 6-month trial. It has gone on a little bit longer than that. But if they are accepted as a longer term form of transport, then the infrastructure questions must be sorted out. And in particular, the provision for it is indeed a motorised form of travel. There is mode substitution for active modes, but also mode substitution for inactive motorised trips as well. And we really need to keep a balanced perspective, I think, and to look at both ends of this. So there is that, but safety is, I'm not going to start talking about safety, but a huge amount of research and huge concerns as well about where the infrastructure is shared between people and motorised transport.
Okay, thanks. Last, Boris is also my friend and who runs a e-scooter startup company in Hong Kong. So Boris?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so my company works on e-scooter, and we also work with the Hong Kong governments to give trials on e-scooter, and we are going to have our next trial, the third trial actually in Hong Kong, from Sylvia's University to Science Park for half a year, 6 months. So some quick question is first, is there any study of the accident rates of e-scooters compared with cycling? And second, how about the passenger flow of e-scooters on a certain width of a track? Is that higher than bicycle, and how much higher than private cars? And the third question is any data about the integration of e-scooter with public transport? Say, do they piggyback them onto mass transits or buses, and then they can scoot both the first and last miles, or do they need to rent at both sides? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to disappoint you on the first two questions, because safety analysis is one aspect that we haven't done. There is a comprehensive review of some of the safety of the first trials underway here in the UK, and that's been conducted by the government. So there was no real point in us duplicating that survey and doing it with our research fund. So we will wait and see what comes out of that. But safety is an issue internationally, and particularly there are different kinds of accidents, I think, that happen with e-scooters than happen to with other kinds of modes, and that needs to be taken into consideration. In terms of integration, so the shared e-scooter schemes have got different modes of operation here in the UK. Some of them are docked schemes, some of them are dockless, and there are also the proposition in terms of how integrated the provision was with other kinds of modes is something that went into the early design of the schemes themselves. So again, we can't think about this as being a sort of a free market enterprise where people could choose, or service providers could choose exactly what they wanted to do and where they wanted to put their services. At the moment, because it's still in the trial phase, it's been quite regulated. So I can't, unfortunately, Boris, I can't give you any further information on that at this time. But then there was a further question about renting, which I'm sorry I didn't quite grasp that question. But at the moment, the self-owned e-scooters in the UK can only be used on private land. All of the schemes should be available are shared e-scooter schemes where there is a supplier who registers people to use them and checks things like the driving license and so on, and that implies the age as well of the person. And they take responsibility as well for the positioning and the recovery of the vehicles. So we aren't in a sufficiently mature market, and we aren't in a free market to be able to seriously consider some of the questions that you've got there. But I think these are longer term things that we really have to pick up on, assuming that these will go ahead for the longer term in the UK.
Okay, thanks, Susan, for answering all these interesting questions. I think e-scooter is rapidly developed in many regions and countries, and a lot of uncertainties at this point. I think that's why a lot of urgent questions, how to implement it in practice and what kind of research we can do in future. I think there's a lot of potentials to explore, and look forward to your further studies of your data, and good luck with the other continue the trial of the study. So thank you. So next, maybe we invite Professor Sandeep Chakrabarty, and his presentation will be on the future of urban mobility in India, challenges and opportunities. Sandeep, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sylvia. I just shared my screen. I hope it's visible.
Yes, it is.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so thank you, Sylvia, and thanks to all participants for joining this. As you can see on my screen, this presentation is about the future of urban mobility in India. And my focus here would be in reporting from India and basically highlighting some of the fundamental challenges that need to be overcome to promote sustainable low carbon transportation in Indian cities. I'm also going to talk about some of the initiatives that have already been taken and to what extent they have been or are being successful in promoting sustainable low carbon travel in India. I'm also going to talk about, evaluate whether electric cars can solve some of these larger problems. And also, so that we can think together about whether EVs, at least in Indian context, can in fact exacerbate some of the problems in the absence of complementary or associated policies. I'm not going to talk about one study, but rather I'm going to pick from the literature as well as some of the current studies and surveys that we are doing, and to understand what is known and what is unknown. And I'm going to, stimulate so that this presentation can stimulate some research questions, and so that the research community can think about how these can be addressed. So moving on, I'm going to talk mostly, there are mostly challenges and few opportunities. I'll probably take that skeptical view and let's see where we go. And I'm going to talk about three major challenges. The first is about the challenges of arresting an explosion in personal motorized vehicle adoption in the country. I'm going to talk about the challenges of implementing some of the routine policies or regulations regarding, to reduce transportation emissions. And I'm going to finally talk about the challenges that India is facing in gradually transitioning into full electric mobility in cities. And I'm going to focus on why these challenges are unique and India specific. And as I said, how research can help. We are going to focus on that. Okay, so the first part would be on the challenges of arresting the rapid personal motorized vehicle adoption. And if you look at this chart, this is not unknown. Of course, the pandemic, has taken its toll on the sales of automobiles. But if you look at the sales of automobiles from 2011 to 2021, you will see that the two blues, the light and the dark blue, which is, two-wheelers and four-wheelers, passenger vehicles, grown from about 15 million units per year to about 25 million units per year. A dramatic increase in the sales of personal motorized vehicles over this 8-year or so period that we are tracking. If you look at the growth rates, you will see these are just numbers from this chart. which basically shows that two-wheelers have increased an annual growth rate of about 8% over that period. Passenger vehicles just under 4% over the period 2011 to 2019. And just as to give you some perspective, population growth has been under 2%. So clearly, this is far at a far faster rate than the population was growing, and in fact, even the adult population was growing. So now, what's interesting to note is that, well, why is this a problem? Why is this a bigger problem? Is because, like many other contexts, the automobile industry links vehicle manufacturing and vehicle sales to economic development and economic growth. And the government has recognized, as in many other countries, as linking the auto sector's contribution to GDP, and more so that, after the pandemic, the automotive mission plan of the government wants to, raise the contribution of automobile sector towards GDP from 7% to 12%. So that means more cars, and the fact that, selling more cars is important for the country. Now, you can always argue that, hey, you can have more EVs in the share, and that's a good thing. But we all know, and there's a lot of reporting, that the pandemic, at least in an Indian context, is going to delay EV expansion, both because of lobbying from the automobile industry, but also because the government has recognized the importance of the automobiles, right? Perhaps it's a little better for e-scooters. So what I'm arguing is, we need to face it, that non-electric personal vehicle sales reduction is not aligned with India's current economic priorities, which from a sustainability perspective is a problem. The other problem that I wanted to highlight in this context is the high, aspirations of personal vehicles and high tolerance for congestion that some of our studies have shown. So, for example, we have seen very recently in ongoing studies, we see how getting out of unemployment and rising incomes are positively associated not only with vehicle purchases, but also the household level aspirations of owning 2 or 4 wheelers. So we see that, and we are conducting some studies to that effect. Some other studies have shown how youth and education, higher education, is associated with the propensity to own a car or stated preferences for owning a car. Quite a bit of literature out there. What we also know from a recent survey is that middle and high income individuals, a large share, own cars that are driven by chauffeurs or drivers, hired drivers, and they are individuals that have an incredibly high tolerance for recurrent congestion or even travel time unreliability, which shows that higher congestion and unreliability are not going to throw people out of the car market, which is a concern, right? And therefore, reductions in car ownership is not naturally aligned with where we are heading as a country in terms of what the government's priorities are, or how the society, the direction in which society is moving. But what's interesting to note is that we, as our cities, if you look at this table, we see that not so recent, but at least some survey data or census data show that only 4% of total trips, well, this is commute trips, but 4% of total commute trips in urban areas are contributed by the automobile. And at this rate, our congestion in cities, you can see, the level of congestion, and that's where, there is a literature which talks about premature congestion, which is that higher levels of congestion than disproportionately high levels of congestion given the level of motorization. So how can our cities even accommodate this boom in personal vehicles that's coming our way, right? And we can talk about, we can't build our way out of congestion, and building, great separated intersections and all of that is not going to help. But it seems to some extent that supply side increases are essential. But we all know where that will land us, right? At least in this group, we know that supply side increases are probably not going to help us. Now, the other problem that we observe include metro rail investments. What we see is a disproportionate amount of government investments in boosting or investments in metro rail as opposed to bus transit. And you see that there are many cities that are building metro rail very fast. But again, those cities where metro rail infrastructure is well built out, even those cities like the capital city of New Delhi is struggling to retain riders, struggling to meet forecasts and remain viable. The other metro systems are just too small to have any impact. So the question is that how can these investments meaningfully contribute given the way that the cities are growing and the way that the informal sector as well as various activities are getting distributed? The problem is that, you know, bus investments, and given that bus systems are much more flexible, the disproportionate policy focus and investment focus on metro rail is possibly contributing to even more greater demand for personal vehicles, right? And can metro rail be a panacea to car explosion? Probably not, because again, it's a zero-sum game. The more we invest in metro rail, there's lower that we can invest in bus transit, which is probably not a good idea. We were talking about bicycle sharing systems. Bicycle sharing is probably going to be a key part to promoting not only alternative modes of transportation, but also electric transportation, from electric buses to shared electric modes of transportation. But again, there is this huge infrastructure gap in terms of safe environments for cycling that needs to be plugged in order for India to move towards meaningfully to contribute to sustainable transit. The other issue is that we are building high-speed highways, 140 km/h, and those are efforts to make driving even more attractive. And at what cost? Most of our cars, at least indigenously produced manufactured cars, don't even meet international car standards. We don't even have airbag requirements on the passenger side. Seatbelt laws are not enforced. We don't have road fatality data at the level or whatever that we need. And at the same time, we are making driving even more attractive. The other problem is the unregulated private sector, right? Which is, Ubers and all. And we have recent research coming out about how, looking at Uber strikes and, corresponding changes or increases in congestion to give us a sense of whether or not Ubers and the Olas here are contributing to congestion or alleviating congestion. And we know that they are contributing rather than alleviating congestion. And then there are safety issues associated with shared pooled ride hailing, which is again throwing off people from the shared mobility market and promoting more personal modes of transportation, which again is clearly not a great thing. Some of our recent surveys that we conducted during the pandemic shows how a disproportionately large proportion of young people are favoring favoring private vehicles more than public transit. So here we ask the question whether they're going to use the following modes more or less frequently than before. And 70% of young folks, we are looking at the age group of 20 to 30, 20 to 35-ish, and 70% are saying that they're going to use public transit less than before. About 90% say that, more than 90% say that they're going to use private vehicles more than before, and so on and so forth. Not only they think that they're going to use less, but when we ask them about what do you think about others, and the same kind of pattern continues, which is a shift, at least a stated shift away from public transit towards adoption of more private vehicles. Now, we need to evaluate whether these perceptions and stated preferences are stable over time. We don't know whether these stated choice findings are going to be consistent with actual behaviors and what the implications are for a post-pandemic world. But what we do know is that we need to conduct a lot more research to understand or maybe conduct experiments to suggest what kinds of behavioral nudges or employer-based modal disincentives can help. We need to conduct way more evaluations and impact assessments of the programs that we're we've implemented, and the fact that we live, at least in India, in a data huge data gap, or let's say it's data zero world, where there is no systematic nationwide data on travel behavior or travel choices. So, can e-mobility reverse these personal mobility trends, and how so? I don't know. Is growing personal motorization okay, as long as it's in the electric format? I don't know, but these are some questions that need to be understood. Now, I'm going to quickly move on, and I'm going to skip a particular section in the interest of time, and I'm going to focus on the challenges in transitioning to electric mobility. And is electric mobility the solution to all of these, this explosion in personal mobility and all the other externalities that personal mobility brings with it? What we know is that in India, we have an ambitious program with very little success. And India in 2013 launched the National Electric Mobility Mission. And along with that mission, we launched a scheme which is called the Faster Adoption and Manufacturing of Hybrid Electric Vehicles, called FAME, in 2015. And what we do know is from 2015 to 2020, the goal was to achieve about 16 million electric vehicles by 2020. And we as a country was able to achieve less than 2% of the target. And the overwhelming focus was on fiscal incentives for the purchase of personal vehicles. It didn't really work out. And then in 2019, a course correction was made, and FAME Phase 2 was launched for the 2019 to 22 period, with a dramatic shift in our focus, which is from personal electric mobility to public transit electrification. Okay, so a dramatic shift to public transit electrification and electrification of two-wheelers for private mobility and 3- or 4-wheelers in the commercial sector. What we do know is that even that shift didn't quite work well. I mean, of course, there was a pandemic in between, but in 2021, less than 5% of the allocated funds or government subsidies and funds were spent. And, and we have extended that goal to 2024. So Sylvia, if I can take 2 more quick minutes just to wrap up. Okay, so, what is the industry perspective? What we know from industry is that the biggest impediment for even public transit to adopt or deploy electric buses at scale, and for commercial vehicles to adopt electric vehicles, the commercial for businesses to adopt electric vehicles is charging infrastructure. But then we know that's a problem. Everybody knows that's a problem, and we also know that a lot of research is underway. But what we know is that that some other issues have been flagged. For example, in the consumer side, there are very few banks that are providing adequate loans for electric vehicles that on average are twice the price. Lack of awareness about personal and social benefits of electric vehicles. Range anxiety is real and more influential than we had anticipated in the past. And scooter, again, FAME 2 was about electrification of two-wheelers, but then consumers argue that electrification takes the convenience out of scooters and the flexibility that it offers in space and in time. Businesses are skeptical of the benefits, and therefore e-commerce players have been incredibly slow in adoption and deployment. Even in the B2B segment, business to business segment, where the government wanted to promote, adoption is very low. Even ride-hailing companies, Ubers and others have, and car-sharing companies, the Zoom Car and others, adoption extremely low. And they blame the government, that is the industry, that there is a national strategy, but a lot of state-level differences. If petrol and diesel are at affordable rates, this shift is not going to happen, and therefore probably we need a carbon tax. But then very few studies tell us the effect of the feasibility or the effect of a carbon tax, at least in an Indian context. We know very little, and so on. Now, a recent study is useful, which, not one study, but there are multiple studies, including some of our own surveys, try to figure out what are the barriers to adoption. Now, the barriers to adoption are well known, but then what is not known is the ways to address those barriers. For example, if you look at shortage of charging stations, high upfront cost and all of that, well, there are many different disciplines that are actually taking care of that, from operations research to engineers. But I think, from an urban planning perspective or urban transportation planning perspective, there are certain factors that need to be addressed. For example, skepticism among adopters on safety and reliability of such systems, consumer perception or lack of awareness. How do we address them? What is the one? And if we do address them, what would the impact on adoption be? And the other thing, which I personally think is, the incentives. Most government incentives so far in India has been on purchase, subsidies to purchase prices. Is that enough? Are there other innovative incentives that can promote adoption, on the demand side, and also promote more manufacturing? We don't know. But then that's a space where much more research needs to be done. So bottom line, as many studies, including a Bloomberg study, as it suggests, probably, we don't know whether these forecasts or how good these forecasts are, but it suggests that at this rate, we are only going to meet about 6.6%. Well, it may not be that specific, but let's say less than 10% of total vehicles sold in India by 2030 would be electric. Well, that would be a huge miss of the whatever targets that we have set. So my question is again that, can India afford that? But more importantly, given the population size and the rate at which population is growing, can the world afford that? And how can the global transportation planning community contribute to addressing some of these problems? So so with that, I will end. I've taken more time than was allotted to me. Sorry about that. Over to you, Sylvia.
Thanks, Sandeep, for this very exciting talk and covering many future transport in India and a lot of challenges. And I also see two audience raise their hands.
Sure.
And Boris and Ransford, again, please try to keep your question short. Okay, maybe Boris, or I think Boris.
I think Boris's hand is from the previous.
Also, okay, sure. Then Ransford,
Yeah, I'll ask two quick questions, if I may. So, I do research about ride-hailing and its impact in the context of Africa, and there was something you've said in your presentation briefly about ride-hailing, the safety implications in the context of India. Now, in the context that I research in, before ride-hailing, conventional taxis were shared essentially. So it took up to 4 passengers on the route if they share the same route. But then with ride-hailing, people are refusing to share for safety reasons. And I'm really struggling to understand, the gap between how conventional taxi was initially used, which was essentially a shared mode. And now that you have ride-hailing, which is just the interface is the app. So is this the same thing in India? And if so, what are the reasons why people would probably share conventional taxis, but wouldn't want to share ride-hailing? And then also on the issue of electrification, I think you touched briefly on this, and also the TNCs, ride-hailing. How is policy sort of evolving, or if at all, towards making sure that they also provide, a fleet of electric cars to contribute to some of the climate goals and energy consumption goals that exist in India? And the last question, if I may, to what extent are the smaller occupancy vehicles like the tricycles and the ones that we find very common in Indian cities, to what extent are they part of the electrification sort of agenda in India?
Sure, thank you, Ransford, for the question. So let me just take your questions in order. Yes, so what we're basically, the first question was about that, if we look at historically, we've always had paratransit that, where people shared a vehicle. So why is this hesitance? Well, from what I know is that the markets are, they do overlap, but the markets are still quite distinct. Paratransit caters to, well, if I may use, income and affluence you know, ride hailing at the price points that we see ride hailing operating, at least in Indian cities, the consumer market is a little different. And this is a group that would, many of them could actually own and operate a personal vehicle, but they don't for whatever reason. So that's partly maybe addresses that question that, you know, this is a group that is not really ready to adopt shared mobility or are more skeptical given the safety concerns and other things. So their tolerance for or acceptability of unsafe conditions could be quite different from this other group, and that's part of the reason. And you know, what unsafe events are doing is it's basically throwing this group out of the ride-hailing market or the shared ride-hailing market into personal vehicles. And we all know that once you get a car, you hold on to the car, right? And that has been a huge problem even during the pandemic. Some of our surveys show that, you know, how people who had decided never to get a car and were dependent on ride-hailing for most of their trips, they actually, a large share actually did whatever an anxious purchase of a vehicle given whatever the experiences during the lockdown and all of that. Now, once they have a car, they're going to use that car, and it's very difficult for them to sell that car, and that's a problem. So that's one. The second question was about mandates for, I think, mandates for ride-hailing companies to move to EVs. Currently in India, we don't have such mandates. Whatever we see is, you know, incentives. For example, as I showed to you, this scheme that we have now provides incentives for purchase of four-wheelers, four-wheeler EVs, as long as you use it for commercial purposes. Now, in India, most of, you know, let's say Uber, the model is very different from the US or many other European countries. Most Uber drivers here are career drivers, and most Uber fleets are owned by some, you know, some person or some group that own a large number of Uber vehicles, and career drivers drive those cars. So it just works like, you know, the rented taxi model. It's very similar to that. Now, well, the idea for the government was that if we provide incentives, then there would be these fleet owners would be incentivized to purchase EVs, at least to some extent. That is happening to some extent, but not enough. And the other is that the Ubers and others are proactively, as part of their messaging towards, you know, contributing to sustainability, especially in an environment where there is a lot of opposition against their, you know, impact on cities. They are proactively launching, you know, electric vehicles. But so far, it has been more about the messaging and communication, but not really a meaningful impact in increasing their meaningful effort at increasing their share of EVs. And the last question, very quickly, smaller occupancy vehicles. Yes, again, if we look at the scheme itself, again, you know, smaller occupancy vehicles, we have something called autos, what we call, you know, autos are three-wheeler vehicles, which are used as paratransit, often, you know, fixed route, but often flexible route on demand. Not app-based, but generally you can just hail the ride and, you know, stop them. So again, there are incentives for even those three-wheelers to transition, but there are no mandates. And especially, you know, given the fact that within the last, whatever, 5-10 years, many of these autos had transitioned from gasoline and diesel to CNG. There could be hesitance in making another transition and investments in transitioning to an EV. So maybe that could be a reason why, in the presence of incentives, adoption is still low. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sandeep. All right, so I'm the last presenter in the presentation session. So let me share my screen. Okay, so I hope you can see it now. And Shirley, can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. So so today my presentation is about the spatial planning of the public EV charging facilities in Hong Kong. So I hope with this presentation, I will present a case not only for the case of Hong Kong, but also provide a reference for other high density cities who are in the transition for the e-mobility era. So this presentation is based on a working paper that is co-authored by Dr. Yong Hong Guo from University of Hong Kong and Mr. Ka Kit Sun from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And Ka Kit is also in the Zoom meeting, so he can help answer some questions if it's related to his work. So just some basic statistics in Hong Kong, and the time we did this study is in 2019. And back then we have about 660,000 private cars and about 12,600 EV. So EV accounts for 2%. And so move back to 2001. And then the latest statistic is we have about 660,000 private cars and EV almost double, but still the percentage is only about 3%, still a very low percentage in terms of the whole private car vehicle fleet. So as I mentioned earlier, Hong Kong government published a roadmap for electrification of the private cars, and by 2023, there will be no more ICE cars on the road. So that would be a very big challenge for us to provide this smooth transition. And Hong Kong is a very high density city, as many of you know. And the image on the upper right, you can see that this is a personal garage. But in Hong Kong, it's a very rare case because many of us live in high-rise apartments or flats, and not many of us can actually own a garage. It's a very rare case. So for EV owners to charge their cars, actually they have to rely on public car parks that have EV charging facilities. So that is the challenge we're facing right now in Hong Kong. So from this Google Earth image, you can roughly see that in Hong Kong, we have about 3 regions: Hong Kong Island in the south, and the northern tip is the CBD and the busy commercial urban areas. And to the north of the Victoria Harbour, we have the Kowloon Peninsula. And these two combined, we consider as urban areas. And then to the north of Kowloon, we have a region called the New Territories, which include the new towns that were started to develop since 1960s. And then the rest of areas, the country park and also the rural area. And so the landscape from Hong Kong, you can see that it's very much a lot of the country park, but the available land for development is very limited. So in order for us to have a more efficient allocation of the space to build public EV chargers, we need to come up with a spatial planning scheme. So the methodology we adopt for this working paper is use a location allocation model, or called the LA model. And we actually applied this model 5 years ago in the case of Beijing. And essentially, we can have the supply side and demand side. So we can, from the government document, from questionnaire survey, interview, etc., to try to derive as many as parameters as constraints for this location allocation model. And then we can use an optimization technique to derive the best solution or the optimum locations to deploy the new chargers. And in the case of Beijing, you can see that we divide the whole city into different sensor zones. And we assume that the demand of this charging coming from the central. And we also collected the potential locations for the new chargers, which include the public car parks and petrol gas stations, which were back then considered as feasible charging stations by the Beijing government. And then from the location allocation model, we can actually assign the charging demand to the nearby supply side. And also we can describe how many chargers should be deployed in a certain location. So this is the basic framework we will adopt And in the case of Hong Kong, we actually make a lot of advancement in terms of the methodology from the supply analysis, demand analysis, and the LA model. So first, from the supply analysis, we further break down the potential car parks by the land use patterns. So that includes the residential, commercial, government, and industrial. And from this table, we can see that we actually can derive what are the current chargers belonging to different land use patterns. For example, commercial land use now accounts for about 36% of the existing chargers. And then the government also account for more than 30%, followed by residential. So this percentage we actually follow in our model when we apply, we deploy the new chargers. And then from the demand side, our demand estimates come from a questionnaire survey, which we did in 2019, an online survey with about 1,000 respondents. And we asked each respondent their intention to buy an electric vehicle in the next 5 years, with 1 indicating definitely not, and 7 indicating definitely yes. And in our model, we only account for those who indicating definitely yes, and try to understand what are the factors affecting those who indicate different levels of buying intention. So we use a generalized auto-appropriate model to understand this person's intention to buy an EV in the next 5 years. And in the model, we include a number of variables that try to explain that, including individual characteristics, household characteristics, and district level social demographic data at the residential and workplace district. And and then we can apply this coefficient combined with the microcensus data to get the neighborhood level average probability that a person will buy an electric vehicle. Then with this probability, we can multiply it by the neighborhood's eligible persons to buy an EV, which we define as those who are 18 years older and who have a driver's license. But so far, we only get this total number of EV purchase demand for each neighborhood. It still needs not the charging demand. To get to the public charging demand, we need to get the PD, that is the percentage of EV charging on a single day. And the PPUP is the percentage of EV using public chargers. So these 2 parameters we derive from the questionnaire survey, because from the questionnaire survey, the current EV owners indicate that they charge the car about every 4 days. And then they, about half of them will use public chargers. So when we map out this charging demand, we can see that in Hong Kong Island, the demand is actually not very high compared to other regions in Hong Kong. We explained that this is probably because in Hong Kong Island, we have a very high density of public transport network. It's very convenient for people to take public transport. And being the most expensive area of Hong Kong, the land price and parking fee is also very expensive in Hong Kong Island. That may discourage people to own and also drive a car. And then we can see that in Hong Kong, in Kowloon side, there's some substantial charging demand, especially from the Kwun Tong district and Kowloon district. So Kwun Tong district indicating in here that is about, this is number 2, sorry, that is a number 1 in the bubble. So that is a CBD 2 in the making. So the last is for the new territories. And that is more interesting. We find that many new towns in Hong Kong, we see a very large demand from the new towns, and including Tseung Kwan O, number 3 bubble, Tsuen Wan is number 4, Tuen Mun number 5, Tien Shui Wai and Yuen Long number 6, Tai Po number 7, and Tong Chung number 8. So we explained that in these new territories, people still need to come to the urban area for commuting, and there's a substantial demand for owning a car. So that's why the demand for public charging is also very high. And so when we derive all the supply and demand estimate, we can pull together into the spatial optimization and with a number of constraints. So in the optimization, we have two objectives. The first one is to minimize the penalty for EV charging, shortfall. And then the second one is to minimize the travel time. So at the end of the model, we can solve the problem and suggest whether a car park among the feasible choice set, whether a car park should have or build an EV charging facilities. And if yes, how many chargers we should build for each charging station. So those would be the solution. And comes to the result. So among the 332 existing charging stations, our model suggests that we need another 113 new charging stations in Hong Kong. So it's a very substantial expansion of the charging network. And for the established charging points, our model also suggests that we need to expand 244 stations by adding new chargers to these locations. So at the end, we will have 1,500 new medium chargers and about 700 new quick chargers. So at the end, in total, combining existing and new public chargers, our model suggested we need about 4,700 public chargers, which is surprisingly very similar to what the government has been targeted by 2025, which is 5,000. And our model can also separate the location and how many chargers for quick chargers and medium chargers. And some of you may wonder why there's no standard chargers in our model. Is because from the Hong Kong government's policy planning, they do not plan to add standard chargers in the public chargers because it would take a long time to charge. So rather, the government suggested we will focus more on the installation of quick chargers and medium chargers to the existing network. So come to the conclusion from our spatial planning of the public EV charging facilities in Hong Kong. And our model suggests that we need to expand the existing charging network substantially, which actually require a lot of budget, be it coming from the government or from the private side. And also it requires a lot of urban space. And how to get this space is, I think, quite a challenge for the land limited Hong Kong. The second point is that the charging network need to span into other neighborhood, urban neighborhoods, and also the suburbs, including many new towns. This is quite contrasting to what the government is now implementing. What the government is implementing now is focusing on the adding charging stations to the CBD and the urban commercial area, rather than in the suburban area. However, from our model, we actually see a lot of demand coming from the suburban area, including many new towns, and also some urban neighborhoods, such as in Kwun Tong and Kowloon City, which is considered the Kowloon side. The last finding is that we find we can add more chargers to the existing charging stations. This is more efficient and more economic compared to adding new stations. And this can be also explained by the fact that Hong Kong has very limited land and very difficult to find feasible land to build new stations. The second one is that in Hong Kong, adding a new station, the fixed cost is very expensive. So that would eat up the budget. So rather to build new stations, we can actually expand existing charging stations to make a full use of capacity. So with that, I will stop here and then see if we have any questions. Thank you. So any questions? Yes, I see Im from Singapore and also Ransford.
Hi, can I ask a question now?
Sure. Thanks for coming.
This is Kian from A-Star Singapore. Thanks, Singapore, for the presentation. I particularly very interested in the case because I'm working in the project that is very looking at a large-scale electrification in Singapore. So first, apologize if I'm probably I don't know if I understand the presentation properly, so forgive my naive question. One of the questions I have is the input of your model is based on the demand if people planning to buy an EV or not, but it's not on the trip demand. And that means that you not account for this in the office location or is the residential location, because the demand can be high at the residential location, but they can charge it, you know, in the office building, or they can charge at the commercial building. So at the moment, I'm not sure if I'm missing anything, but I thought what you have in it now is only the residential demand charging. Is it the case?
Okay, so thanks for your question. So far we actually plan the demand of the neighborhood, so at the neighborhood level. And in the survey, we ask the person, so where they live, which district they live, and what is the probability they plan to buy an EV. So according to our model, we actually think that if a public charger is built close to a person's residential area, that would be very facilitating for people to do overnight charging, and then to drive their car the next day. And we are not excluding that people will actually charge in a commercial building or in the government building. But in terms of the demand side, we actually aggregating to the neighborhood where people live. So based on the residential location. And from our survey actually indicating that in Hong Kong, people also charge their cars in different locations. But our model mainly want to suggest that where we want to need to build more charging facilities.
Thanks, Silva. And just one small clarification. So in your charger, does it include slow charging or fast charging?
In our new chargers, we in Hong Kong, we don't call it slow charger. I think that is maybe equivalent to the standard chargers. But in our model, we do not consider the standard chargers because we do have standard chargers right now, there's existing chargers. But in terms of expanding the current network, the government do not propose to add more standard charger to the charging network. Rather, it want to focus on the quick charger and medium charger. So that's why in the solution, we do not have any new chargers classified as the standard chargers.
Thank you, Silva.
Thank you, Dean. Okay, Ransford?
Yes, Sylvia, thanks for the really interesting presentation. I think my question is also related to what was asked by DM initially about the input variable, which is essentially the demand variable is coming from the intention to purchase EVs, which then forms the basis of the demand projection. So I was thinking that, have you thought about flipping that assumption of rather having the supply of the infrastructure dictating, the adoption and use of EVs at the neighborhood level? And I'm thinking that could be a really nice way of actually verifying or a bit of validation exercise, taking the output of the model and trying to see how it can promote. It could be even in terms of intentions or even over time, how the supply, if it is following that model, is actually bringing about an increase in adoption of electric vehicles.
Okay, thanks, Ransford, for this very good suggestion. I think that this one, we also kind of come across a similar suggestion from the papers with external reviewers. So they think that it may be as a more dynamic.
Exactly.
Right. That is a supply and demand side, and in our model is sort of treating the demand is kind of this exogenous. So then we estimate it first. But I think for the model, it's feasible to do it, but I think it's require different thinking. But in terms of, I think the survey, it would be quite costly to do it because we need to figure out the solution, and then we may need to do another round of the online survey. So and then I think this heuristic approach I think theoretically, I think it's very nice, but I think in practice, it may take a few more rounds of this survey, and at the end we may not come to a convergence. So I think this we will take it into consideration. So and see if there's a more feasible way to have this dynamic thinking of the supply and demand side. I fully agree with you that the projected new supply will affect the demand, but in practice, we have not figured out a more cost-efficient way to do so. Yeah.
And just quickly, if I may, I think also the modeling paradigm can help address some of these challenges. So I think the location allocation modeling is quite, static sort of snapshot, but maybe some form of micro simulation or agent-based modeling could help capture these sort of dynamic, interactions between demand and supply, and then yield some interesting results.
Thanks. I think modeling and simulation can capture that. So we can also try that out in future. Thanks. So Sam.
Yes, Sylvia. I remember I saw a video talking about in Beijing. There's now some battery swapping station that it takes about 1 minute to swap a charged battery. And if that's the case, because we're talking about cars, not trucks or buses, which I understand is the battery are very heavy. But for cars, if in Beijing they did that, and if Hong Kong introduced that kind of battery swapping stations, I think it will be a very efficient and welcome by people, because instead of charging overnight or at your home, just like now when we drive our car, it's low petrol, and then we just go there and swap 1 minute, and then we full charge again, and it's also more efficient for a mass charging of I mean the charging station there. I'm sure they will get a discount from the power company if they have a facilities to keep charging, especially overnight. Usually the charge rate is much lower, and something like that. And do you think it will happen in Hong Kong, or do you think any problem or any issues that need to be solved?
Okay, thanks, Sam, for this interesting suggestion. I think this is a model. I know that in some mainland cities and some Japanese cities, this available, but not widely adopted yet. My personal view is that with this battery swapping station, it can help refuel the battery very soon. But if you think about the cost of the electric vehicle, the battery actually accounts for a huge percentage. So that comes to how we price this battery swapping service. Because if you swap a battery, then the depreciation of the battery, how to be valued and priced into this service. Otherwise, I think the EV owners are not paying sufficient amount for the battery depreciation. And that will I think will demand a very big calculation. The second point I want to make is for this battery swapping station, it also comes to where is the location, because people also need to think similar to charging your gasoline vehicle, where is the location choice, and whether there is certain restriction, the service. How to standardize the battery among different car brands and makes, that would be also something we need to figure out. But I think in general that could be something is one of the possibilities, and I hope technology one day can.
Yeah, I think sooner or later we need less petrol stations. With the internal combustion engine car getting less and less, for sure there will be available land, I mean, from change from the existing petrol station to this kind of swapping battery station.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so thank you all for attending the first round presentation. Sorry, we are overrun a little bit. So without further ado, let's start our roundtable discussion. I need to pull out my okay, so let's see. Okay, Shuli, can you see it?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, good. So now the second part of today's workshop is a roundtable discussion. And we have a number of questions, some hot topics for us to discuss. So for each topic, we have some lead discussion. So the first topic is about the e-mobility in the bus industry. So far, I think in today's presentation, we talk about electric vehicle mainly from the personal private cars perspective. So maybe I will invite Mr. Alok Jam to give his views and perspective. Alok?
Yeah, thank you, Sylvia. So just to put things in perspective, and interestingly, we are coinciding this this session with COP26 that is happening in Glasgow, which is talking a lot about environment and what actions we have to take to make the meet the targets and save the planet, basically. So just putting things in perspective, at the moment, transportation accounts for approximately 25% of the total GHG greenhouse gas emissions in the world, and out of which 45% of that is actually the passenger vehicles are actually emitting that. So zero emission vehicles have been around for quite some time, which is primarily the electric buses. And it's only in last 2 years or so where the total cost of ownership of e-buses actually started to look more attractive. So even from financial perspective, e-buses are looking fantastic and in various cities. So we are seeing a big tilt towards e-buses all around the world. So for example, India is doing this FAME 2 that Sandeep was talking about. In Europe, they have Zeus project where they are actually European Union is giving a lot of subsidy towards e-buses. So at the moment around the world, there are about 600,000 e-buses, which generally comprises of about 15–16% of the global fleet, and 40% of all the new sales are actually electric buses. 98% of the buses sold in China are actually electric buses. So China is obviously the leader in this segment at the moment. Outside China in 2020, there were about 5,000 electric buses, which by 25 is expected to reach about 14,000 buses. Bloomberg actually makes a projection that by 2040, 83% of the global sales will be e-buses. So e-buses are exploding, in whole of the urban landscape at the moment. And of course, there are a lot of concerns about moving to electric buses in the sense that how it will impact the electricity demand and things like that. So that is something that we have to address in the urban environment. So what we are seeing right now, that when it comes to buses, we are looking at this whole case, connected, autonomous, shared, and electric. And this is the kind of framework that is developing towards e-mobility. And the expected targets are that with the electric buses in the cities and having the power source that is coming from renewables, we should be able to decarbonize our cities, around the world. So with that, I will end and I'll take any discussion questions.
Okay, thanks, Alok. How about the audience? Would you like to join the discussion on this topic? Boris and Kathy, yes. So
hi, Alok. Sorry. Yeah, Mass.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Just one quick question. How about letting the electric bus being charged by overhead cables if they can run mostly on fixed routes, for example, a highway. So they can be mainly powered by the overhead cable without a super big battery.
Yeah, well, this is called in-motion charging. And actually, in many of the European cities where you had the trolley bus infrastructure, in-motion charging is quite popular. China is doing a lot. Beijing, Shanghai, they have in-motion charging in certain segments. But I think constructing that infrastructure from ground up is quite expensive. And of course, it requires a lot of urban, there are aesthetic issues and the whole creating a new infrastructure. Those issues really prohibit at the moment in installing them in built urban area. But if there are greenfield new towns, let's say in Hong Kong, if we are developing places like Kutung or Hung Soi Kyo, then surely, yes, we can install the electric overhead wires and make it electric in-motion charging infrastructure. The advantage of in-motion charging is that you can, currently in an electric bus, there are about 350 kilowatt hour of battery, which is roughly about 3.5 tons of battery on the buses. And if you go down to in-motion charging, you don't require more than 50, 60 kilowatt hour of battery, which is, reduces the dead weight of the bus significantly. And that also means that you can carry more people in the bus. So yes, it is indeed a very, I would say feasible proposition. Yeah.
Thanks. And I also want to add to that, there's also a synergy with e-scooter, because if you have some point-to-point electric bus, and then some of the passengers can carry the e-scooter or rent one, and to finish their first and last mile.
Yes, indeed.
So the whole trip will be electric.
Well, something that I had been discussing with another, in the European market, I actually drafted with the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, the whole electric bus policy framework. And one of the ideas, of course, was that if you could have the e-scooters and you come to the bus and you fold the e-scooters, and that can go inside one of the, I would say, cavities or under the seat of a bus. Yeah. And you can actually even charge the e-scooter there inside the bus. So yes, that is surely, it's a design issue and can be done very easily. E-scooters are not very heavy and they can easily be accommodated on board the buses.
Yeah, I often do that too.
Okay, thanks. Kathy?
Thanks.
We can't hear you.
You're muted.
You're muted, yeah.
Sorry. Thanks very much, Alok. So 2 questions from my side. The first question is that I heard a lot of talk that electric bus, especially in Hong Kong, due to the terrain and everything, it's very heavy. So I've also heard about introducing the hydrogen fuel for the bus, which would make it lighter. And also because compared to EVs, I think Hong Kong, the electric bus, the progress is a lot slower. So there's a lot of potentials actually start from scratch, is from hydrogen instead of electric. We would like to understand your view on that. And then the second thing, I also was in another workshop, understanding because promoting an electric bus is expensive investment from bus operator. Mm-hmm. So what do you think that we can make it a more financial sustainable model if we want to put electric bus or hydrogen fuel bus to make it a sustainable development?
Sure, yeah, very interesting questions, Kathy. So, okay, electric bus in Hong Kong. Now, there are a lot of myths around that. So obviously, Hong Kong with double-deck buses, and if you want to run them on a pure electric, they are a bit of a challenge. You require, the trial at the moment the city bus is doing, which has about 450 kilowatt hour of battery, which is 4.5 tons of battery. So, and so that is one challenge. So putting so much battery inside the bus, and as the battery has to be at the lower end of the bus, which means you compromise a lot of seats. And the second challenge in Hong Kong, and this is very particular to Hong Kong market, is Hong Kong restricts an axle loading to 9.5 tons. And the bus laden weight, a double-decker 3XL bus, is approximately 24 tons bus. So you have to just make sure that you balance it in such a way that any of the axle doesn't exceed 9.5 tons. So this weight balancing in the structure of the bus is a second challenge in bus design. The third challenge is that Hong Kong requires a very stringent tilting test. So the buses have to go on a deck and the 22-degree angle, and the bus should not be tilting at that angle. And that is the third challenge with double-deck buses that Hong Kong, which creates a lot of challenging proposition for the bus manufacturers. So with combining all these, 3XL buses and double-deck buses with so much battery is a challenging proposition for Hong Kong. And that is why we have seen a slow adoption for electric buses in Hong Kong. But having said that, the batteries are getting better and better every year. We are seeing 10 to 15% increase in weight to density ratios of the buses. And obviously that will make it more sustainable. Other thing is the total cost of ownership. So I'm jumping to your second question first. So total cost of ownership. The total cost of ownership of electric buses is already comparable or even lower in many places, or like Hong Kong, surely it's lower than your ICE, the diesel buses. So the problem with electric buses is that the cost is upfront. So it's the capital cost is higher, but the fuel cost is very low. So our maintenance cost is very low. So over its life cycle of, let's say, 12 to 17 years, the electric buses are much cheaper actually to own. Talking about hydrogen. Now, hydrogen is surely a fuel that is hyped at the moment. Everybody is talking about hydrogen, and it is a great fuel. Hydrogen has 3 times the energy as compared to, let's say, diesel on a kg to kg basis. But hydrogen, 1 kg of hydrogen takes a lot of volume as compared to 1 kg of diesel. Hydrogen liquefies at minus 250 degrees centigrade. So you obviously, if you really want to have a diesel type of a hydrogen, you pump it in, then you require a lot more, infrastructure to cool it down. What we right now do is we put it under very high pressure, and that creates a new type of challenge in creating pressurized gas stations where you can fill them into the buses. But the good news is that 40 to 45 kg of hydrogen in a double-deck bus can serve the same purpose as as the diesel buses. It can serve the whole day. It gives you the same range. So that is really quite viable. But the problem hydrogen is the source of generation. So if you're generating hydrogen from renewables, you're good, but it is very expensive at the moment, and the economics don't work out. So most of the people are actually using blue hydrogen or gray hydrogen, and blue hydrogen basically comes from fossil fuel sources, but associated with carbon sequestration. And then you have gray hydrogen, which is usually, it's basically dirty hydrogen, gray hydrogen or a black hydrogen, which has basically the emissions are happening somewhere else. And you put them in hydrogen and bring it on. So that really doesn't achieve your decarbonization goal. It gives you zero emission buses, but doesn't achieve the decarbonization goal. So, but hydrogen, having said, the good news is that Hong Kong has announced that it will trial hydrogen. We don't have any hydrogen, unfortunately. So it has to come from China, or it has to come from somewhere else. And at the moment, hydrogen is roughly costing you $5 to $7 per kilograms, which is quite expensive to a proposition to use. But yes, it surely is the cleanest fuel that is available to mankind at the moment.
Okay, thanks, Alo, for sharing your insights. And as a very experienced consultant in the bus industry and giving training all around the world, I think he's definitely the expert to go to. Okay, so in the interest of time, let's move on to the next question. Okay, so next one will be autonomous vehicles. So Ransford, would you like to lead the discussion?
Yes, so thanks, Sylvia. So in the context of our discussions around, e-mobility, the future of mobility, I thought it would be useful to also pay attention to some of the new and emerging transport technologies. And that is the reason why I thought we should focus on, autonomous vehicles and also connected autonomous vehicles and transport in general. So just to give a bit of context, I mean, this new transport technology, there's a bit of a hype, if I should say, around it. And there are so many promises that it's seeking to offer, at least from the side of those who are building it. So we are expecting, or there is a promise that AVs will integrate clean energy. So talking about hydrogen fuels and electric vehicles. So that potential, exists, and that is one of the promises that is being offered. The other thing is that AVs would inherently support shared mobility, and the reasons that is given are quite obvious. First and foremost, with AVs, we can move away from rigid station-based car sharing systems, where you have to rebalance the cars either physically or find a way of rebalance the distribution of the cars, to now having flexible, free-floating systems, because the vehicles drive by themselves, circulate the city and can respond to demand. So demand-responsive transport, which is very flexible as opposed to station-based car sharing scheme. And if we can get more people to share, then we can reduce car ownership and potentially car usage in general. We also know, at least from simulations and other projections, that the uptake, a high uptake of sharing, is very good for the environment for some of the reasons that I have stated, including a potential reduction in car ownership, having clean energy sources and reducing our dependence on the car. But then one thing that I want to, I think, provoke a discussion around is something that is emerging from some of the research that we've been doing, and which also resonates with other research that I've come across, is that, when we look at the preferences for autonomous vehicles based on the stated preference studies that we have done, they tend to be deeply embedded in attitudes towards existing forms of motorized transport. So what that means is that people who are in favor of car ownership would want to own an autonomous vehicle when the technology becomes a diffused mode of transport. And then similarly, those who are currently sharing would want to do sharing. And then those who are using public transport are more inclined to using autonomous buses if they become a possibility. Now, in one of the studies that we conducted in Dublin a couple of years ago, we found that currently in our respondents, which was over 1,000 respondents, we found that the use of conventional car sharing, it's very low. It's just about 1%. And then when we try to build our scenarios around shared autonomous vehicles, we're also realizing that it was the least popular, it remained the least popular option as far as preferences were concerned. So that was just about 5% of our respondents actually, were open to this idea of shared mobility in the era of autonomous vehicles. Now, what we also find is that, ownership on its own, or ownership combined with other ways of alternatives of utilizing this technology, such as sharing and public transport, is really, really high. Okay, so I think based on this, essentially, I wanted to, let us have a bit of conversation around how best we can help overcome the barriers to shared mobility in the context of autonomous vehicles. And can we even do this? Is it even possible to overcome these barriers to shared mobility? And if so, to what extent can we do this? What are the opportunities? Are there any existing emerging opportunities that we can tap into to nudge more people, if I can put it that way, to share? And my last sort of provocation is around who will likely be the potential benefits, okay, or enjoy the potential benefits that would accrue from future shared mobility that is connected to AVs, and what would the implications be for inclusive, equitable, and environmentally sustainable transport. So these are, sorry, I'm asking you questions, but I hope in asking these questions, it will generate a discussion, and hopefully we will also, I will also have the opportunity to answer some questions from you. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Rensburg. And I see Buvana from Germany raise her hand. So Buvana. You're muted.
Muted.
Thanks, Stanford. I'm myself a researcher in TU Dortmund working on travel time use. Like during travel, what are the activities they engage in? So whenever I come across the autonomous vehicle is the next generation that comes, the next policy-oriented discussion. So my question to you is like, or maybe just discussion, because you asked this shared mobility is really attractive for the autonomous perspective. What do you think? Because that may also end up in long commuting, right? Like when you don't need to worry about driving, people tend to drive long, and maybe it's they just tend to spend some activities and then they enjoy the ride. So that ends in long commuting also. How do you perceive that? And next, when it comes to the acceptance, it's always a question of trust. From the public perspective, they don't immediately trust any technology. They will have some kind of always doubt to use a new technology. So how probably you come across this when you made a report, collected the questionnaire, when you come across this question or something related to trust of the technology. And the third is something, the activities, what they tend to do while traveling in autonomous, because there are some vehicle design that's specifically for leisure, for work, and something, those traveling with children, women with children or men with children, for the social interaction. So do you also perceive that, like with respect to design of this autonomous vehicle, because they don't drive and they have more time, and how this is, this has been spent with a utility perspective.
Yeah, thanks. Those are really useful questions. So I'll start with the question of trust. Yes, so I think we have a comprehensive framework, behind with which we model the intention to use or the adoption intentions. And one of the variables that we take into account is, attitude towards technology in general, and then their attitude towards automation in particular. And then what we're finding out is that there is an inverse relationship, between the two variables. So, to frame it another way, if people are more pro-technology and pro-automation, they see the benefits of automation, then they are more inclined, more likely to want to use autonomous vehicles, open to this idea of autonomous vehicles. So, and then the reverse is also true. And we find actually a gender disparity. So one of the things that we find is that women or females were less likely to trust autonomous vehicles as compared to their male counterparts. And I think other studies have also found similar findings. Younger people, again, are more open to automation as opposed to older people. So the issue of trust is something that, there is sort of how people perceive it varies across, different socio demographic groups and some of the other factors that I'm unable to go into here. The question around time use. So certainly that is also one of the things that goes into our model there. We have a general construct of perception of benefits, and we separate the perception of benefits into the utilitarian sort of commuting benefits, reliability, convenience, flexibility. And then we also have the time use, in-vehicle time use benefits. Yes, there is a stronger perception of these benefits, but I totally agree with you that, especially if vehicles are allowed to roam around, okay, then that in itself is going to, there's that potential that people are going to be more car dependent, because first and foremost, there is a major barrier to driving. Personally, I don't drive because I've never held a driver's license, right? The moment you remove that barrier with autonomous vehicles, then anybody can get into a motorized form of transport, whether a car or a bus. And we need to start to think about those possible implications in terms of getting more people into using vehicles, or rather, how it sits with our goal of trying to reduce vehicle auto dependence, if I can put it that way. So I think these are some of the questions that we keep thinking about, but because the technology hasn't fully materialized, then it's very difficult to really find answers to it. That said, the vehicle, the car as we know it, has been with us for over 70 years, right? Since the 1920s, and we already know the impact that is having. And I always say that autonomous vehicles are just cars, with artificial brain. So on that basis, we can begin, to actually extrapolate, as it were, what the likely impacts are going to be, which for me wouldn't be too different from conventional vehicles. Your third point was about vehicle design, and that's really an interesting point. So I think also one of the barriers to sharing and one of the ways to overcoming it could actually come from design, how we build the vehicles. And this is something that is quite difficult to test at the moment, unless you have access to different sort of designs, models of the vehicle. But we have a separate stated preference survey, which focuses specifically on sharing. And in that survey, we create a scenario in which we project different types of vehicle designs. So, I mean, you have the conventional sort of sedan, design for sharing, and then there's also this pod-like design that people see. And our idea, we haven't actually analyzed the data yet, but our idea is to see the effect that the vehicle design, at least visually, has on the likelihood to want to use it, and also to want to use it as a model, a sharing model. So yeah, I mean, I hope I've answered most of your questions adequately, but I guess the challenge still remains as to how to overcome some of these major barriers from a design, from a behavioral, and maybe even from urban planning point of view. How do we get people to share if we think that is the future?
Okay, thanks, Ransford. And understand it's your ongoing research, and maybe you can also share some link in the chat box. I understand you have some published papers related to this topic, so you feel free to share the link in the chat box. Okay, so next we will move on to the next topic, that is active transport, active mobility. So we will have Kathy to talk about this, leading our discussion. Kathy?
Okay. Hello, thank you. I guess I'm the one discussing that this active mobility is not exactly a future mobility, because it's contributes to part of our daily trips. But I think it's a very important topic to sustainable development. So let me first define active mobility. Mostly refers to walk, cycling, and in recent years, an emergent term called personal mobility device, such as scooters and skateboard, are also included in this definition. So extending beyond the environmental benefits, active mobility contributes to social benefits, such as healthier lifestyle, activated street space, and promote social equity. And that's why active mobility is also important to promote it together with other new e-mobility for sustainable development. So although the density in Hong Kong has made our city quite walkable, as Sylvia shown the map of Hong Kong, that we are very, very densely populated. So, but let's go through some of the key figures in Hong Kong, which we can do more to capture active mobility trips. So the first is the walk and ride. Rail and buses account for more than 70% mode share in Hong Kong. But based on the previous travel characteristics survey in Hong Kong, the average walk time using walk as a trip leg to and from another mechanized trip is only 5 minutes or less. So when we took a further detailed analysis, we found that many Hong Kongers still would use feeder service for the last mile or first mile to the rail stations. Maybe that is due to the terrain or the walking environment. So how to encourage the mode shift to use walk to close the gap for the first and last mile to public transport will be very beneficial to encourage active mobility. And then the second thing is cycling and the personal mobility device. But based on the statistics in the first 3 quarters of 2020, 80% of the fatal and serious injured traffic accidents involve cyclists. So how to make cycling or personal mobility device safe is also the future, how we can encourage active mobility. And then the third one is the need to improve the walking environment for aging population. So by 2040, approximately 1 in 3 people in Hong Kong will be aged more than 65 years old. So keeping them active to have a quality retirement life and reduce burden to our medical care system will also contribute to sustainable development in Hong Kong. So right now in Hong Kong, there are many ongoing initiatives to promote active mobility, but there are more we can explore. So first one, I think Arab has been commissioned to do many walkability studies. And one of them is the hillside escalator links and elevator system, which we identify areas that are like hilly terrain and trying to further extend the rail catchment instead of using the feeder surface. But besides providing the connections, we also think thermal comfort is a very important element to encourage walk. So in a previous research we did with Chinese university, we found that the more open space they can see the sky, the more it discourages walking. That means people are very afraid of the white sun above their head. So in district-wide studies, I think there's a potential that we can carry out more solar and thermal analysis to advise where to add shades to improve the thermal comfort to encourage walking. Also, how our wayfinding system can include the indoor environment would be very beneficial to extend our walking distance, because in Hong Kong, there are so many buildings, and we always take the opportunity to go through a mall for temporary cooling during the summer, but we don't know the routes. So if we have some applications that allow us to know the indoor shortcut, I think that would also be beneficial. In terms of the aging population, if we want to enhance the walking environment, I think we can start injecting some open space pocket parks to create active neighborhood, to link up the neighborhood trails to promote active mobility. And final thought is that the cycling and the personal mobility device, I think is a very good way to promote it for medium range trips in terms of active mobility. But I cannot stress more that improving the safety is fundamental. Whether we should introduce exclusive right-of-way, looking at spaces underneath the expressway, or utilize the harborfront area, I think it's something that we can explore. So there are more things we can do to promote active mobility, how our future can promote it, or even using some of the EMobility can promote active mobility along the way. I think your ideas are very welcome.
Okay, thanks, Kathy. So I think very interesting and important transport mode, and thanks for sharing your also latest projects on this topic. So may I know the audience, would you like to chip in your thoughts, especially those who are based in Hong Kong, and this is your opportunity to share your thoughts and discuss with yes, Boris.
All right. Yeah, I think Hong Kong is having a greater and greater environment for walking, especially some elevated walkways in like Tsuen Wan or in the CBD, and perhaps in the future we can further extend it to cycling tracks. And I want to add to that, if we want to enlarge the catchment areas of public transit, we cannot just use walking, because most places are quite far away, and walking is really hot, as you said. They don't want to walk under the sun. So if we can switch some of them from walking to scooting or to cycling, well, scooting is better because even if you cycle, then it still generates a lot of heat. And if we have cycling tracks with shades perhaps made of solar panels, then to further shade them, then the catchment area can be like 5 times longer. That means 25 times the area of the original catchment area. And then we'll have a much faster feeder service, and more people will be willing to take the public transit.
Yeah, thanks
And
very
by the
much.
way, yeah, and electric can also serve people on the hills or who need to go along hilly landscape.
Yeah, thanks very much. I agree. For the urban area in Hong Kong, because of the limited road space, is a little bit relatively difficult to implement cycling trail or the e-scooter because we are in a very mixed environment, and I think walk trips I think would be relatively preferable. But for the new towns, especially a lot of new development that we have right now, I think that's an opportunity to rethink our connection feeder strategy to the rail station to promote the public transit using these new modes. And again, the safety issue, I think this is something it's good that you share the link of the trial that Hong Kong government is seriously looking into the safety aspect of this e-scooter. So I think those findings will be helpful to formulate the legislation and policy in Hong Kong to protect both the e-scooter and the pedestrian as a feeder service, or to cover some of the medium range trips as walk trips cannot be covered. So we are hoping Hong Kong government will do more initiatives on those aspects.
Okay, thanks, Kathy. Any questions from the audience? So I actually want to ask Kathy that you mentioned in the urban area, there are not that lot of room for trying out new services or new future mobility. And then you mentioned that a new town sort of new development area could be a new playground. So what's your view that the government, would the government kind of loosen up the policy to implement this future mobility, including facilitating active mobility in new towns when they design? Because in the older generations of new towns, they're not very walkable, many of them, compared to the urban areas. So so in the next generation of new town, especially the northern metropolis in the policy address, what's your envision planning for that area?
Right. Thanks for the question. I think traditionally in the past, as a transit planner, we always focus on traffic impact analysis. But I think in the future, for the new town development, I think there will be more focus on pedestrian analysis. It's developing a holistic way of how these new developments would generate impact on the pedestrian facilities, and to actually needs to pay for those pedestrian improvement schemes to connect with the neighborhood. Because just now I also mentioned about the Asian population, which is true, right? There will be more demand of those neighborhood. So in Hong Kong, I think it has been guidelines that try to increase the open space in general. So I think it's a good opportunity to integrate this open space area along with this pedestrian planning to come up with not only just sole functions of walking, but as a way to promote mental health, well-being, that kind of sustainability. I think that would be a very good way of triggering how we should put more investment in those areas.
Yeah, very much agree. I think if we think about the potential impact to the public health, well-being, etc., of the walking, cycling, etc., then we should actually invest more of the infrastructure and make the urban realm, urban space, and the activities surrounding the pedestrian path and cycling path integrated together into the planning. That I think is a different way of integrating planning.
Yes.
Okay, thanks, Kathy. And last but not the least, let's move on to the last discussion question. We have the post-COVID urban policy. So we have Dr. Yimi Wang from University of Bristol to lead this discussion. So Yimi.
Yeah, I'm just turning on my video. Can everyone see me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I'll just make a start. So, the topic is kind of related to my latest research interest. So actually, as Sylvia probably knows, so I've also secured a WUN grant recently on a different theme, but related certainly to this question. So what I've been thinking in terms of e-mobility is very much about an ongoing change of urban form and its implications on travel behavior, on transport infrastructure, but also on the broadly defined urban public policy. So I think COVID certainly has changed our cities a lot. And partly, I've recently actually written a blog, a post on my blog, talking about whether cities will continue to exist in many places after the COVID. Because I suspect the spread of coronavirus and the huge cost in terms of millions of people who passed away due to this deadly disease has shaken our belief in city. And if you look at what's happening in the UK, so in the UK we have a term called the so-called metropolitan elites, so the middle class, typically middle class, relatively wealthy Londoners have been moving out of central London to the suburbs and even to the countryside. So it's kind of analogous to the white flight or rich flight phenomenon we observed in the USA in the 1960s, 1970s. The implications on central cities in general, and also on the public finance and funding for all sorts of social infrastructure, including transport infrastructure. I think the implications are substantial. So if we think about more and more people moving to the countryside and leaving relatively disadvantaged and vulnerable population in the city center, and this kind of population in the past tend to rely most on public transport. But nowadays, so this morning I was and some anecdotal evidence. So I was giving a lift for my son to his school. So I have observed is that more and more people are moving back to their cars instead of using public transport. In the past, I used to take bus from my suburban home to the university in city center, but now I drive myself nowadays. So that's one observation. Then another observation is, I think, as the several presenters have mentioned, more and more young people seem to use e-scooters instead of trains or buses. Yeah. So I think the knock-on effect is if fewer and fewer people are using the regular public transport services, then more and more middle-class families are moving out of the cities, then at a certain point of time, there will be a tipping point for the local government to ensure sufficient funding for the public transport infrastructure. So let alone the issue of e-mobility or charging points. So we somehow are a bit too ambitious ambitious, because I think the challenge, at least I think many UK cities will be faced with, is the hollowing out of central city as a potential consequence of COVID. But I do feel that the UK government is actually very proactive in terms of trying to achieve this net zero target, and in terms of promoting electric vehicles. I think by 2025, all of the new vehicles in the UK market will have to be electrical, according to the UK government initiative and policy aim. But I think that will be a hard-pressed policy transition, considering the current UK economy, considering the changing urban form, as I've just mentioned. So I think I probably will paint a relatively pessimistic picture at this point. So these are all going to put huge pressures on local government in terms of funding, in terms of public finance, in terms of squeezing out resources to support the transition to e-mobility. So I guess that's all I need to say at this stage. But I think I'll probably open the floor to the audience, in terms of especially audience from the other parts of the world, because I tend to be more familiar with the UK policy context. But I suspect this kind of challenge probably also exists in many other countries and cities.
Okay, thanks, Yiming, for sharing the situation of UK and sharing your concerns about the post-COVID situation. So how about the audience? Would you like to share your views? Or any questions for Yiming? So I have a question for you, Yiming. You mentioned about this post-COVID situation, and people's behavior are changing. And also when we have new emerging mobilities, the public finance may have shifted the focus. So I wonder if, what's your view about this new mobility and emerging transport to the social equity? So do you think that while cities are promoting e-mobility or phasing out the ICE vehicles by a certain timeline, would you think that that shift the priority to a certain mode, and then which may not benefit some lower income social strata? What's your view about that?
I think some sorts of innovation is urgently needed to run, intra-city public transport infrastructure. For instance, all of the buses in the city of Bristol are now, not all, but almost all of them have been electrified. But then there's a challenge for drivers, because clearly, the drivers are working in that kind of environment. And if nowadays the UK government doesn't make it legal for all of the passengers to wear face covering, but there's certainly a potential risk for the driver. So that's partly the source of the problem in terms of the UK lacking sufficient number of bus drivers and also the lorry drivers at the moment. So I think there needs to be some bold transitions in terms of how to smartize the public transport infrastructure, even including experimenting with manless vehicles, driverless vehicles, automatic vehicles. So I think that certainly finally the issue boils down to funding, how prepared the local councils and governments are in terms of prioritizing funding for central city transport infrastructure to keep people in the city center and giving them a sustainable but also safe and accessible, affordable transport infrastructure. So I think it's very much a supply side issue, but the long-term effect also depends on people's commuting behavior, ridership, whether we can we can persuade the people to return to their usual habit of using public transport.
Okay, thanks. So any other questions for Dr. Wang? So in terms of the settlement, I understand that your new WUN project, maybe you can also share a link to the chat box. You try to investigate this post-COVID, the social network. So what was your observation or preliminary hypothesis how this COVID would impact the social network in the UK, especially your research interest is on the immigrants and the marginalized groups. So do you have any observation at this point?
So I think central cities have been apparently hit the hardest during the COVID pandemic for all sorts of reasons, higher density of living, right? And also like any central cities, we have some relatively impoverished neighborhoods, and there are some neighborhoods in the city of Bristol, and I think which is also probably the case in many other UK cities. There are some communities within which English is not even the prevalent language spoken. So a lot of the communications regarding vaccination, regarding testing, regular testing, are not communicated very well to people in this community. So I think the impacts of COVID citizens of different class, income, and ethnic backgrounds are rather different. I think a lot of empirical research has confirmed that. Now the challenge for post-COVID cities is that how a lot of these issues have been there even before the COVID. They're just not so apparent when the COVID hit us. But now these become quite clear, readily clear, and I think in terms of the implications on post-COVID governance is whether the UK governments, in particular the local governments, whether have the determination as well as the resources to tackle these long-standing issues. I think COVID simply has exacerbated the problems, so made them more apparent. But now probably it's the time for us to think about these issues and try to address them more systematically.
Yeah, I think I agree that the COVID change probably will change the urban form. Essentially, it will also affect people's behavior and what the government needs to provide to support or promote the new transport mode. And I see the Ransford raised his hand. Ransford, maybe this will be the last question of today's discussion.
I was just I got intrigued with your analysis about post-pandemic city, and couple of thoughts are running through my head now. So initially, when the pandemic started, and then if you looked at the geography of the pandemic, it was high density, central areas. But currently, if you look at the UK now, the geography of infection is the other way around, right? So you have a more sort of suburban, infection. And one of the reasons is that, kids are going to school, they live in suburban areas, and they are picking, the infection, and it's the other way around. So, I mean, in terms of arriving at conclusions as to what will happen to city centers, is it personally, I mean, I don't think there's going to be that dramatic effect, because again, if you factor in other constraints, like as you rightly pointed out, some middle class and probably affluent people, they have this flexibility, they are more mobile to go to different places, but there are really huge sort of structural constraints in terms of housing supply, what somebody can afford. And other things that would not necessarily lead to some of the outcomes that, scenarios that perhaps we were thinking about initially. So if you factor into, the dynamics and the changing geography of the pandemic itself, then probably people will come back to learn that, well, it doesn't really matter where you live. Maybe we can have some discussion about the conditions and the attributes of accommodation in different places. Especially now, people are now more open to, having more spaces in their rooms with balconies and that kind of thing. So potentially that is how the city is going to reinvent itself, especially central areas, to accommodate some of these emerging, preferences and, hopefully needs. But then there wouldn't be that kind of total decline of central areas. It's just my reaction, based on how things are unfolding.
Yeah. So yes, I think the latest trend in terms of because there's a recent surge of cases in the UK, mainly due to pupils returning to school. So as Ransford pointed out rightly, so I think the situation concerns me mainly because of the potential loss of job opportunities as a result of people moving to a suburb. And if you think about the livelihoods for central city communities, so they rely on service jobs, but service jobs follow population, follow middle class families in most cases. So I think we don't know yet, but what we can kind of perceive at this stage or observe at this stage is the ongoing transformation of cities as a result of pandemic. So we will be keeping an eye on it, and then try to see the implications of these changes.
Great.
Okay, so thanks, Yiming. And so that comes to the end of today's workshop. And I think today we have a very dynamic discussion and exchange between the speakers and the audience. And we have learned about the e-mobility, including e-scooters, electric vehicle, and also e-bus in the bus industry, etc. And talk about different challenges in the UK, in Hong Kong, in India, etc. And at the same time, we also I mentioned about several new emerging transport modes, such as autonomous vehicle, and at the same time, some traditional mode but will exist, continue to exist in future cities and smart cities, including walking and cycling. And I think the experience from some successful countries, such as Denmark in promoting electric vehicle and Norway in promoting electric vehicle is really worth for our further study. At the same time, some challenges facing in India, in UK, and also in Hong Kong, how to promote the e-mobility and how to change people's public acceptance and address their concern also, I think require further research. At the same time, the government's policy changes, and at the same time, practitioners adding this gap, how to make this a policy and more feasible in different projects. And I think today we are very successful in attracting people from 20 countries and regions joining today's workshop. And that's why we have a very dynamic discussion. So with that, I thank all the speakers and Professor John Torgerson, Professor Susan Graham-Muller, Professor Sandip Chakrabarty, and also the discussants, Mr. Alok Jan, and Dr. Yiming Wang, Ms. Kathy Low, and Dr. Ransford, a champion point. So also I appreciate all the attendees, participants in these workshops. So this will be a series of workshops related to low carbon transport. And we expect to have another workshop coming soon, probably next year. So I hope see you again next time. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you, Sylvia. Bye.